Behind every great battle of the Great Patriotic War stood not only the genius of military commanders on the front lines, but also the brilliant mind of a strategist in the quiet of staff offices. Among these individuals, Army General Alexey Antonov holds a special place. A man whose name remained in the shadows for many years despite his colossal contribution to victory. He did not command fronts, did not accept surrenders, and did not stand on the mausoleum tribune during the victory parade. His weapons were maps, a compass, and a phenomenal memory. And his battlefield was the strategic operational plans that changed the course of history. Effectively leading the general staff from December 42, Antonov became the architect of victorious operations from the Battle of Kursk to the storming of Berlin. Yet even among military historians, his name was long mentioned only in passing, as if, amidst the brilliance of Marshall's stars, the man who coordinated the actions of all fronts and armies was lost. Such is the fate of a staff officer, even the most brilliant, to remain in the shadow of the glory belonging to the commanders on the front lines. Alexey Antonov was born on September 12, 1896, into the family of an artillery officer in the city of Grodno. His father, Innokenty Alexeyevich, hailed from an ancient noble family and served in the Imperial Army, which largely predetermined his son's future path. His mother, Teradzia Ksaverievna, of Polish descent, instilled in the boy a love for languages and a broad cultural outlook. Alexey's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of military discipline and respect for military traditions. Even as a child, he showed unusual diligence and an interest in the exact sciences, qualities that later made him an outstanding staff officer. Young Antonov was particularly good at mathematics. He could spend hours solving complex problems, developing analytical thinking. Alexey received his initial education at a cadet corps, where teachers noted his exceptional memory and ability to systematize information. Classmates recalled that Antonov could memorize entire pages of text after a first reading, and in tactical classes, he intuitively found optimal solutions that were not always obvious even to experienced officers. In 1916, Alexey Antonov graduated with honors from the Pavlovsk Military School in Petrograd. This was the time of the First World War, and the young officer was eager to go to the front, but his analytical abilities were noticed by the command. Antonov was sent to the headquarters of one of the formations, where he first encountered the planning of military operations. It was during this period that the unique working style of the future strategist began to form. Colleagues noted his ability to see the battle situation as a whole, to take into account many factors, and to anticipate the course of events. Antonov could work for hours with maps, analyzing troop positions and calculating possible enemy actions. The February Revolution of 1917 found Antonov in the active army. Unlike many officers, he did not emigrate and did not join the White Movement. His pragmatic mind allowed him to see the historical prospects of the unfolding events. In 1920, Alexey Innokentyevich joined the ranks of the Red Army, where his experience and knowledge proved to be in demand. The revolutionary events of 1917 became a turning point for many officers of the Tsarist army. Alexey Antonov, unlike thousands of his comrades in arms, chose to support the new Russia. This choice was not dictated by political convictions. Rather, his analytical mind allowed him to see the historical inevitability of the ongoing changes. Antonov spent the first years of the Civil War in staff positions, where his talent for planning and organizing combat operations was noticed by the command. In 1922, he was appointed Chief of Staff of a rifle division, a position that required not only military knowledge, but also the ability to work with people. many of whom were mere workers and peasants just yesterday. It is important to understand the context of that time. The Red Army was undergoing a period of formation when old officers with imperial education had to find common ground with commanders from the people. Antonov, with his calm demeanor and respectful attitude towards subordinates, regardless of their origin, managed to create an effective staff work system. One of Antonov's colleagues from that period recalled, "He never raised his voice, never berated anyone. His authority was built not on fear, but on deep professionalism. When Antonov gave instructions, even experienced commanders listened with bated breath. So precise and well thought out were his plans." In the mid-20s, Alexey Antonov was appointed to the staff of the Moscow Military District. Here, his organizational abilities fully unfolded. He was involved not only in planning exercises, but also in developing new methods of combat training that took into account the experience of the recently concluded Civil War. It was during this period that Antonov began to form his own approach to military planning, based on a thorough analysis of all factors, from the geographical features of the terrain to the morale of the troops. Colleagues noted his astonishing ability to retain vast amounts of information in his memory and instantly retrieve the necessary data at a critical moment. By the end of the 20s, Antonov already had a reputation as one of the most promising staff officers of the Red Army. His professional growth occurred during a period of large-scale military reforms, when the Army was transitioning from revolutionary enthusiasm to strict military science. Alexey Antonov actively participated in this process, contributing to the development of new regulations and manuals. An important stage in Antonov's career was his studies at the operational faculty of the Frunze Military Academy, which he entered in 1928. Here, his natural abilities gained a theoretical foundation, and his circle of professional contacts expanded through acquaintance with future commanders of the Red Army. Admission to the Frunze Military Academy in 1928 marked a turning point in Alexey Antonov's career. Here, within the walls of the main forge of Red Army Command cadres, his natural analytical talent received a powerful theoretical foundation. The academy in those years was experiencing a period of intellectual flourishing. Soviet military thought was actively developing, reflecting on the experience of the First World War and the Civil War. Antonov avidly absorbed knowledge, spending long hours in the library studying the works of classics of military strategy, from Clausewitz and Jomini to the latest works of Soviet theorists. Of particular influence on the formation of his strategic thinking were the ideas of Mikhail Tukhachevsky on deep operations and Vladimir Triandafilov on sequential operations. The concept of massive use of tanks, aviation, and motorized infantry for a rapid breakthrough of enemy defenses and development of success in operational depth was deeply imprinted in the mind of the future chief of the General Staff. Classmates recalled that Antonov stood out even among the talented students of the academy. During tactical games and map exercises, he demonstrated an amazing ability to grasp the situation as a whole, instantly identifying weak points in the enemy's formation and finding unconventional solutions. One of the academy's instructors noted, quote, "An important feature of Antonov was his ability to synthesize classical military doctrines with the latest technical capabilities. He was one of the first to appreciate the potential of mechanized formations and aviation as means of achieving operational surprise and developing tactical success. At the same time, Alexey Antonov was never a dogmatist. He always emphasized the need for flexible application of theoretical provisions depending on the specific situation. In 1931, Antonov graduated from the academy with distinction. His attestation particularly noted, quote, "These qualities determined the officer's further specialization. operational work in large headquarters where the ability to process large amounts of information and make decisions taking into account many factors was required. After the academy, Antonov was assigned to the staff of the Moscow Military District, where he was involved in planning large exercises and developing new methods of combat training. Here, he applied his acquired theoretical knowledge in practice, gradually forming his own style of staff work, methodical, thorough, with attention to detail, but never losing sight of the strategic perspective. The 1930s became a crucial period in Antonov's formation as a top-tier military leader. After his brilliant graduation from the Frunze Academy in 1931, his career developed rapidly. Alexey Antonov was appointed Chief of Staff of a division in the Moscow Military District, where he quickly established himself as a master of planning exercises and maneuvers. This was a challenging time for the Red Army, a period of large-scale modernization and technical rearmament. Antonov found himself at the epicenter of these processes, actively participating in the development of new operational concepts that took into account the emergence of tank formations, the development of aviation, and motorized infantry. His analytical mind allowed him to organically combine traditional principles of military art with the capabilities of new technology. In 1933, Antonov was transferred to the staff of the Kharkov Military District, where he took up the position of Chief of the Operational Department. Here, his talent as an organizer fully manifested itself. He created an effective system for collecting and analyzing information, and established clear interaction between various branches of the armed forces. Colleagues noted his astonishing ability to instantly grasp the essence of a problem and find optimal solutions. Antonov's ability to work with people became an especially valuable quality. Amidst continuous personnel changes and political purges, he managed to maintain an atmosphere of professionalism and mutual respect within the staff. One of his subordinates from that period recalled, "Antonov never used his authority to pressure or humiliate officers. He knew how to listen and hear, extracting the rational kernel from a multitude of proposals. At the same time, he always took responsibility for the decisions made." In the mid-30s, Alexey Antonov was transferred to the Leningrad Military District as Deputy Chief of Staff. This appointment was a recognition of his growing authority in military circles. The Leningrad District, covering the country's northwestern borders, held special strategic importance in the context of growing international tensions. Here, Antonov gained invaluable experience in planning operations in the difficult conditions of the northern theater of war, with its forested and swampy terrain and harsh climate. A significant milestone in Antonov's career was his appointment in 1937 as Chief of Staff of the Moscow Military District, one of the largest and most important in the country. In this position, he proved himself a master of organizing large-scale exercises, during which the latest concepts of deep operations were practiced. Under his leadership, the district staff transformed into a well-coordinated mechanism capable of quickly responding to the most complex situations. The pre-war years became a period of intense professional growth for Antonov. He carefully studied the experience of local conflicts of that time: the Spanish Civil War, Japanese aggression in China, the Soviet-Finnish War. By analyzing successes and failures, Alexey Antonov formed his own vision of modern warfare, which later proved to be prophetic. In 1941, shortly before the start of the Great Patriotic War, Antonov was appointed Deputy Chief of Staff of the Kiev Special Military District. This appointment presented him with enormous challenges. The district covered the southwestern direction, which the German command considered one of the key ones in Plan Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, the peaceful life of the Soviet Union was shattered by the bombs and shells of the German fascist invaders. For Alexey Inokentievich Antonov, as for millions of Soviet citizens, the most difficult trial of his life began. In the first days of the war, he served as Deputy Chief of Staff of the Kiev Special Military District, which was transformed into the Southwestern Front. However, already in July, he was transferred to the Southern Front, where he was appointed Chief of Staff. It was here, in the crucible of the first catastrophic defeats, that his talent as a military leader truly unfolded. The situation on the southern direction was critical. German tank wedges were dissecting the defense of Soviet troops, threatening to encircle large formations. In these circumstances, Antonov displayed astonishing composure and the ability to make well-weighed decisions even in the most chaotic environment. One of the staff officers recalled, "When everyone else was losing their heads, Alexey Inokentievich remained imperturbable. He could work for hours with maps, analyzing reports, comparing facts, and building an overall picture of the battle." Antonov's main achievement during this period was the organization of troop command and control in a constantly changing environment. He created an effective system for collecting and processing information, which allowed the front command to have up-to-date data on the position of both its own units and the enemy. This was especially important when planning counterattacks and organizing withdrawals to new lines. In August 1941, the troops of the Southern Front were engaged in heavy defensive battles on the approaches to the Dnieper. Antonov developed a plan for a counterattack in the Zaporozhye area, which, although it did not lead to the rout of the enemy, allowed precious time to be gained for the evacuation of industrial enterprises and the organization of defense on new lines. In the autumn, the situation on the southern direction continued to deteriorate. German troops broke through to Crimea and began an offensive on Rostov. In these critical conditions, Antonov proved himself not only as a brilliant staff officer, but also as a psychologist, capable of maintaining the morale of staff officers. His calm confidence was infectious, creating an atmosphere of efficiency and determination even in the most difficult moments. In November 1941, Antonov participated in the planning of the Rostov offensive operation, the first major victory of the Red Army. Despite limited resources, Soviet troops managed to defeat Army Group South and liberate Rostov-on-Don. This was an important moral success, proving that the German army could be defeated. The spring of 1943 became a turning point not only for the course of the Great Patriotic War, but also for the career of Alexey Inokentievich Antonov. By this time, he had already established himself as a brilliant staff officer, capable of organizing the work of large military structures under the most difficult conditions. After successful activities on the Transcaucasian and North Caucasian fronts, where Antonov displayed exceptional organizational abilities, his talent was noticed at the highest level. In December of '42, Alexey Inokentievich was summoned to Moscow and appointed first Deputy Chief of the Operations Directorate of the General Staff. This was recognition of his outstanding merits in organizing the defense of the Caucasus. However, the true scale of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's trust became evident in April of '43 when Antonov was appointed first Deputy Chief of the General Staff and Chief of the Operations Directorate. What stood behind this appointment? Why Antonov, and not one of the more famous military leaders, received such a responsible post? The answer lies in the unique combination of qualities that this man possessed. Firstly, Stalin and his inner circle highly valued Antonov's analytical mind. Unlike many military leaders of that time, he did not just propose solutions, but also presented a detailed justification for each step, calculating all possible consequences. One of the general staff officers of that period recalled, "When Antonov reported on the situation, it seemed as if he saw the battlefield as if in the palm of his hand, taking into account all factors, from weather conditions to the morale of the troops. Secondly, Alexey Antonov possessed a phenomenal memory, which allowed him to keep a colossal amount of information in his head. He remembered the location of all units and formations, their strength, armament, and the combat experience of commanders. This ability made a strong impression on Stalin, who himself was distinguished by an excellent memory and valued this quality in subordinates. The third factor was Antonov's special work style. He never raised his voice, never staged dressing downs, but at the same time, he knew how to achieve impeccable execution of orders. His calm confidence and methodical approach created an atmosphere of focused work in the general staff, even during the most critical moments. Marshal Vasilevsky, who at that time headed the general staff but was often on assignments at the fronts, could be sure that in his absence, the work would be organized flawlessly. Antonov's fourth important quality was his ability to find common ground with front commanders. He never demonstrated the superiority of a staff worker, but always sought to understand the problems of the troops on the front line. Commanders valued him for his willingness to listen to their opinions and take into account the real state of affairs when planning operations. Finally, Antonov's personal modesty was an important factor. In an army where the ambitions of military leaders sometimes led to conflicts, his unobtrusiveness and lack of career aspirations were perceived as a virtue. Stalin, who was painfully sensitive to manifestations of personal initiative and independence, saw in Antonov an ideal executor, competent but not claiming a special role in history. General Antonov's working methods could be compared to the precise operation of a Swiss watch. Flawless, meticulously refined down to the smallest detail, yet almost imperceptible to the casual observer. His workday began at 6 in the morning and often ended long past midnight. But even during the most intense periods, he maintained clarity of thought and the ability to grasp the situation on all fronts simultaneously. At the General Staff, they quickly recognized Alexey Antonovich's phenomenal memory. He remembered not only the deployment of all armies and divisions, but also the personnel strength, the number of equipment, ammunition, and fuel. Marshal Vasilevsky recalled, "Antonov never used a notebook. He kept all necessary figures in his head and could, at any moment, state the exact number of tanks in a particular army or division." One of the key features of Antonov's work was his capacity for strategic analysis. He didn't merely collect information, he saw the bigger picture behind disparate facts, grasped trends, and anticipated the enemy's intentions. At the same time, Alexey Antonov never relied solely on intuition. Every one of his assumptions was supported by thorough analysis of intelligence data, examination of maps, and assessment of the capabilities of his own troops and the enemy. Colonel General Shtemenko, who worked under Antonov, noted his unique approach to organizing staff work. Working with maps, Antonov displayed astonishing meticulousness. He personally checked the deployment of each division, clarified data on the enemy, and analyzed terrain features. For him, a map was not just a schematic representation of troop positions. It transformed into a living picture of battle, where he saw not only the present, but also the future development of events. Antonov's style of interaction with front commanders deserves special attention. Unlike many staff officers, he never displayed the superiority of a desk strategist. On the contrary, in conversations with frontline commanders, Alexey Antonov showed sincere respect for their experience and understanding of the situation on the front lines. He knew how to listen, ask precise questions, and delve into the troops' problems. Marshal Konev recalled, "The most important trait of Antonov as a leader was his ability to maintain composure in the most critical situations. Even when the situation seemed catastrophic, he did not succumb to panic, did not lose his ability to analyze and make balanced decisions. This quality was especially valued by Stalin, who himself possessed an iron self-control and did not tolerate emotionality in the reports of military leaders. Alexey Inokentievich's capacity for work surprised even the general staff officers accustomed to overloads. He could work for days on end, only briefly leaving for short rest. Yet, the quality of his work did not diminish. Even after a sleepless night, he maintained clarity of thought and attention to detail. The summer of 1943 was a time when Alexey Inokentievich Antonov's military talent fully blossomed. It was then, as head of the General Staff's Operations Directorate, that he began planning the operation that was destined to become the turning point of the entire war, the Battle of Kursk. The colossal work of collecting and analyzing intelligence data, assessing enemy strengths and their own capabilities, and choosing the optimal moment to transition from defense to offense. All of this fell on Antonov and his subordinates. Unlike many military leaders, Alexey Inokentievich was not a proponent of immediate offensive action. His analytical mind suggested that the Germans should be allowed to exhaust their forces in an offensive, and then a crushing counterattack should be delivered. This idea of deliberate defense followed by a decisive offensive became the cornerstone of the entire Kursk operation. Marshal Zhukov, recalling the preparations for the battle, noted, "Antonov presented such a detailed and convincing analysis of the situation that even skeptics agreed with his proposed plan. He literally predicted where and when the Germans would deliver the main blow and prepared appropriate countermeasures." A distinctive feature of Antonov's work was that he never limited himself to the scope of a single operation. Even in the midst of the Battle of Kursk, he began developing plans for the liberation of left bank Ukraine and Donbass. His strategic vision allowed him to link the actions of different fronts into a unified system, achieving maximum effect from each offensive. The autumn of 1943, winter of 1944, became a period of consistent successes for Soviet troops. One by one, major cities were liberated, water barriers were forced, and enemy fortified lines were breached. Behind each of these operations lay the colossal work of Antonov and his subordinates, who developed plans, calculated options, and coordinated the actions of the fronts. In January 1944, an event occurred that further increased Alexey Inokentievich's responsibility. Marshal Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff, was sent as a Stavka representative to one of the fronts, and the actual leadership of the General Staff passed to Antonov. Now, it was he who daily reported the situation on the fronts to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, submitted proposals for planning operations, and coordinated interaction between the fronts. The spring and summer of 1944 were marked by a series of brilliant offensive operations, known collectively as the 10 Stalinist blows. The development of this strategic plan became the pinnacle of Antonov's military art. Operation Bagration for the liberation of Belarus, the Lvov, Sandomierz, and Yazh-Kishinev operations. Each of them was a masterpiece of military planning, where precise calculation was combined with a creative approach and unconventional solutions. Army General Shtemenko, who worked under Antonov's leadership, wrote in his memoirs, "His ability to identify the main objective, concentrate forces in decisive directions, and organize interaction between fronts was truly unique." At the same time, Antonov never sought personal glory, remaining in the shadow of the front commanders whose names resounded throughout the country. During the preparation of the Berlin operation, the final chord of the war in Europe, Antonov's role was particularly significant. It was he who insisted on thorough reconnaissance of enemy defenses, on the creation of powerful strike groups capable of quickly breaking through defenses and developing success. His proposals for organizing artillery preparation, using tank armies, and coordinating the actions of 3 fronts formed the basis of the final operational plan. The Supreme Commander's office in the Kremlin was a special place where the fates of millions of people and the course of the greatest war in history were decided. For General Antonov, this room became a true test not only of his professional qualities, but also of his human resilience. His relationship with Stalin was difficult at first, but gradually evolved into a special form of professional trust, so rare in the leader's inner circle. Antonov's first meeting with the Supreme Commander took place in December 1942, when he was summoned to Moscow from the Transcaucasian Front. Stalin, known for his habit of testing new people, met the general with caution. He asked short but precise questions, carefully observing his interlocutor's reactions. Antonov answered calmly, without unnecessary emotion, operating only with facts. This manner made a favorable impression on Stalin. Stalin valued in Antonov precisely the fact that he never tried to guess the Supreme Commander's opinion, Marshal Vasilevsky recalled. He always presented an objective picture, even if it was unpleasant. At the same time, Alexey Antonov never limited himself to stating problems. He always offered concrete ways to solve them. Antonov's working style perfectly matched Stalin's requirements. His reports were concise yet exhaustive. He never got lost in details, highlighting the main points, but if necessary, could present any information with astonishing accuracy. The Supreme Commander, who disliked verbosity, appreciated the general's ability to articulate the most complex issues clearly and briefly. Gradually, a special working relationship developed between Stalin and Antonov. The Supreme Commander increasingly listened to the general's opinion, especially on matters of planning major operations. It is telling that during discussions in Stalin's office, where marshals and generals with famous names and combat merits were present, he often turned specifically to Antonov. One of the most challenging aspects of working with the Supreme Commander was delivering unpleasant information. Many military commanders, fearing Stalin's wrath, preferred to soften negative news or even keep silent about problems. Antonov never took this path. He considered it his duty to present an objective picture, no matter how alarming it might be. At the same time, he possessed the rare gift of presenting unpleasant news in such a way that it was perceived as operational problems requiring solutions, rather than as a pretext for finding culprits. Marshal Zhukov noted in his memoirs, Antonov knew how to tell Stalin the truth without irritating him. This was a rare and valuable quality, especially during the initial period of the war, when the situation on the fronts was often not in our favor. An important characteristic of Antonov, in his relationship with Stalin, was a complete absence of careerism and personal ambitions. In the Supreme Commander's inner circle, where there was a constant struggle for influence, the general stood out for his focus solely on the task at hand. He never engaged in backroom intrigues, never tried to elevate himself at the expense of others. This principled stance did not go unnoticed by Stalin, who, despite his suspicious nature, began to trust Antonov in matters of strategic planning. With the beginning of active cooperation among the allies of the anti-Hitler coalition, the Soviet command faced the task of effectively coordinating military efforts with American and British partners. Alexey Antonov, thanks to his diplomatic qualities and deep understanding of strategic issues, became a key figure in this process. His participation in international negotiations determined many aspects of Allied interaction in the final stage of the war. Antonov's first serious experience in diplomatic work was the Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers in October 1943. Although the main part of the negotiations concerned political issues, Alexey Inokentievich, as a representative of the General Staff, participated in discussions of the military aspects of cooperation. The American delegation noted his precise and well-founded assessments of the situation on the fronts, as well as his deep understanding of the overall strategic picture. Antonov's true diplomatic debut was the Tehran Conference in November-December of the same year. Here, for the first time, the leaders of the three great powers, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, met, and military experts discussed the coordination of actions in various theaters of war. Alexey Inokentievich made a strong impression on his Western colleagues with his professionalism and ability to clearly articulate the position of the Soviet command. General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, later recalled, "Among the Soviet military representatives, General Antonov stood out especially. He spoke little, but every word he uttered carried weight. His arguments were always backed by precise data, and his proposals were characterized by practicality and realism." The most important issue discussed at the Tehran Conference was the opening of the Second Front in Europe. Antonov, based on a thorough analysis of the situation, presented convincing evidence of the need for an Allied landing in France. He argued persuasively that operations in secondary directions, which Churchill proposed, would not significantly ease the situation of Soviet troops. In February 1944, Alexey Inokentievich was officially appointed Chief of the General Staff. This raised his status in negotiations with the Allies. He now acted as a full-fledged representative of the Soviet military leadership. American and British liaison officers in Moscow noted his accessibility and readiness for constructive dialogue. Antonov's role during the Crimean Yalta Conference in February 1945 was particularly important. By this time, victory over Nazi Germany was no longer in doubt, and the main focus was on coordinating the final operations and the post-war arrangement of Europe. Alexey Inokentievich presented a detailed plan for the Soviet offensive in the Berlin direction, coordinating its timing with the plans of the Anglo-American Command. The August campaign against Japan became the brilliant finale of General Antonov's military career. When the last salvos died down in Europe in May 1945, the attention of the Soviet leadership shifted to the Far East. Despite Germany's capitulation, militarist Japan continued its resistance, holding significant territories in Asia and posing a threat to the USSR's Far Eastern borders. Already at the Yalta Conference, Stalin promised the Allies to enter the war against Japan 2 to 3 months after the victory over Germany. Now this promise had to be fulfilled. Alexey Inokentievich Antonov was tasked with developing a plan for a lightning campaign that was to crush the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria. The task was exceptionally complex. It was necessary to transfer huge masses of troops from the Western theater of operations to the East in the shortest possible time, covering a distance of more than 8,000 kilometers. At the same time, the operation had to be prepared in strict secrecy to ensure strategic surprise. Antonov applied all his experience and talent to solve this grandiose logistical and strategic problem. Under his leadership, a plan codenamed "Zero" was developed. This plan envisaged a simultaneous offensive by 3 fronts: Transbaikal, First and Second, Far Eastern. Soviet troops were to strike from different directions, dismember the Kwantung Army, and destroy it in parts. A distinctive feature of the plan was its focus on rapid advance deep into the enemy's defenses. Antonov took into account the experience of the Manchurian Incident of 1939, when the Japanese were defeated at Khalkhin Gol thanks to the decisive actions of the then little-known General Zhukov. Now this experience was to be applied on a much larger scale. The preparation of the operation required colossal efforts. Within 3 months, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft were transferred to the Far East. The railways worked at their limit. At the same time, all movements were carried out with strict camouflage measures. Japanese intelligence was never able to detect the massive concentration of Soviet troops. On August 8, 1945, exactly in accordance with the promises given at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and already on August 9th, the offensive began along the entire front. The effect of surprise was complete. The Japanese command was not ready for such a powerful blow. Soviet troops rapidly overcame mountain ranges, deserts, and taiga massifs, which were considered impassable. Tank and mechanized units deeply penetrated the enemy's defenses, cutting off retreat routes and creating cauldrons. Air assaults captured key points deep in the defense. The Pacific Fleet landed naval assaults on the coast of Korea and Sakhalin. The results exceeded the wildest expectations. Within 10 days of combat operations, the Kwantung Army was completely defeated. Soviet troops advanced up to 800 kilometers deep, liberated northeast China, North Korea, South Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. On September 2, 1945, Japan signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender. World War II ended. The end of the war did not bring General Antonov the long-awaited rest. On the contrary, colossal responsibility for reorganizing the armed forces amidst the nascent Cold War fell upon his shoulders. On May 9, 1945, when the entire country celebrated the great victory, Alexey Antonov was already working on new tasks posed to the army by the changed international situation. In June of the same year, Antonov was confirmed as the Chief of the General Staff of the USSR Armed Forces. This appointment was a recognition of his outstanding merits during the war years. Now he faced the most difficult task: to maintain the combat readiness of the army amidst large-scale demobilization. The first post-war months were filled with intense work. Millions of soldiers returned to peaceful life. Thousands of factories switched to producing civilian goods. At the same time, the international situation remained alarming. Yesterday's allies, the USA and Great Britain, increasingly demonstrated hostility towards the Soviet Union. Churchill's famous Fulton speech in March 1946, in which the term Iron Curtain was coined, marked the beginning of a new era, the era of the Cold War. Under these circumstances, Antonov developed a program for army reform, which envisioned reducing the number of troops while simultaneously increasing their technical equipment. Special attention was paid to the creation of nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. Alexey Antonov perfectly understood. In the new confrontation, victory would go to whoever possessed more advanced technologies. One of the most important tasks Antonov tackled in the post-war years was the comprehension and systematization of the combat experience of the Great Patriotic War. Under his leadership, the General Staff carried out colossal work in analyzing conducted operations, studying enemy tactics and strategy, and identifying the strengths and weaknesses of the Soviet military machine. This invaluable experience formed the basis of new regulations and manuals from which the next generation of officers would learn. In March 1946, Antonov was appointed First Deputy Minister of the USSR Armed Forces. In this position, he coordinated the work of all branches of the armed forces, ensuring their harmonious development in accordance with new threats. Particular attention was paid to creating a national air defense system capable of countering American strategic bombers. Despite his immense workload, Alexey Antonov found time for teaching. His lectures at the General Staff Academy were immensely popular. Officers valued not only the depth of his knowledge, but also his remarkable ability to simply explain the most complex issues of military strategy. By the end of '47, the international situation had escalated even further. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan marked the USA's transition to a policy of, quote, in response, the Soviet Union accelerated the creation of its own system of alliances in Eastern Europe. Antonov took direct part in developing the military aspects of this policy, planning the deployment of Soviet troops in the countries of People's Democracy. 1948 proved particularly tense with the outbreak of the Berlin Crisis. Western powers introduced a new currency in their occupation zones of Germany, which was perceived in Moscow as a step towards creating a separate state. In response, the Soviet leadership blocked ground routes to West Berlin. The world was on the brink of a new war. In these circumstances, Antonov had to develop action plans in case of military conflict, while simultaneously calculating possibilities for a diplomatic resolution to the crisis. Behind the strategic genius of Alexey Antonov was a living person, with his habits, hobbies, joys, and sorrows. What was the man whose decisions determined the fates of millions of people like in everyday life? Those who knew the general closely noted a striking contrast between the scale of his position and his personal modesty, almost asceticism in daily life. Antonov never sought luxury or comfort. His office in the General Staff struck with its Spartan simplicity: a desk piled with maps and documents, a few chairs, a bookcase with books on military history and strategy. No excesses, nothing superfluous. Only what was necessary for work. The general's workday began early. Usually at 6 in the morning, he was already at his desk. Colleagues were amazed by his ability to maintain clarity of mind and efficiency, even after several days with virtually no sleep. Marshal Vasilevsky recalled, "Unlike many military leaders of that time, Antonov never raised his voice at subordinates. His authority was built not on fear, but on deep respect for professionalism." General Shtimenko noted, "Another characteristic feature of Alexey Inokentievich was his phenomenal memory. He remembered not only the location of all units and formations on the fronts, but also the names of commanders, the number of equipment and ammunition." One of the General Staff officers recalled, "Despite his colossal workload, Antonov found time for reading. His favorite authors were Russian classics: Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov. He especially valued often quoting descriptions of battles, noting Tolstoy's deep understanding of the psychology of combat. From foreign literature, he preferred historical novels and memoirs of great commanders. In rare hours of rest, Alexey Inokentievich loved to play chess. This game, requiring strategic thinking and the ability to calculate moves several steps ahead, perfectly matched the skladu of his mind. It was said that he was a strong chess player, capable of putting up a decent fight even against masters. As for family life, Antonov showed the same restraint here as he did in service. He was married to Maria Dmitrievna, who fully shared his views on life and created the reliable rear, without which successful work is impossible. Their family was characterized by an atmosphere of mutual respect and support. The couple had no children, which perhaps brought them even closer. One of Antonov's most touching character traits was his attitude towards his parents. Despite his immense busyness, he found time to write them letters, inquire about their health, and send gifts. When circumstances allowed, he always visited them. This filial care was especially evident during the war years, when, it would seem, all thoughts should have been only about the front. In his relations with colleagues, Alexey Inokentievich always showed tact and respect. He never emphasized his high position, was able to listen, and valued professionalism regardless of rank. Marshal Konev recalled, "Antonov was one of the few people in the supreme military leadership with whom one could openly discuss any problems without fear that your words would be used against you." General Antonov's legacy extends far beyond his direct contributions to victory in the Great Patriotic War. His strategic ideas, working methods, and organizational principles profoundly influenced the development of all Soviet military science and continue to remain relevant in the modern world. One of Antonov's main achievements was his contribution to the development of the theory of deep operations. He did not simply apply existing concepts, but creatively reinterpreted them in light of new combat experience. The plans for offensive operations developed under his leadership in 1943-1945 became classic examples of military art, still studied in military academies worldwide. A key feature of Antonov's strategic thinking was his systemic view of war. He never viewed individual operations in isolation. Every offensive, every maneuver was part of a unified design. This ability to think broadly, to link the actions of different fronts into a single system, is today recognized as one of the most important qualities of a senior military leader. No less significant was Antonov's contribution to the organization of staff work. The system he created for collecting, analyzing, and distributing information ensured the promptness of decision-making even in the most complex situations. Many principles introduced by Alexey Antonov formed the basis of modern automated troop control systems. Antonov's leadership style deserves special attention. In an era when authoritarianism was considered a necessary quality for a commander, he demonstrated the effectiveness of a different approach, one based on respect for subordinates, attention to their opinions, and encouragement of initiative. This style, which can be called democratic professionalism, is now recognized as optimal for managing complex organizational structures, including military ones. The relevance of Antonov's ideas for modern military planning can hardly be overstated. In conditions where wars are becoming increasingly technological and combat operations are conducted simultaneously in various domains, on land, in the air, at sea, in cyberspace, his systemic approach to organizing operations takes on new significance. What lessons can be learned from General Antonov's activities today? First and foremost, it is the understanding of the decisive role of information in modern warfare. Antonov created an effective system for collecting and analyzing intelligence data, which allowed for anticipating enemy actions and taking preemptive measures. In the age of information technology, this lesson becomes even more significant. The second important lesson is the need for flexible planning. Antonov was never a dogmatist. He always took into account changes in the situation and was ready to adjust plans. This flexibility of thinking is especially valuable in modern conditions, where the situation on the battlefield can change with lightning speed. The third lesson concerns the organization of interaction between different branches of service. Antonov was a master of coordination, able to achieve a synergistic effect from the combined actions of infantry, tanks, artillery, and aviation. Today, as inter-service and inter-branch interaction becomes increasingly complex, this experience acquires particular value.